Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the SPSSI Graduate Student Committee webinar series titled Beyond the Ivory Tower, Bringing Activist Conversations to Academic Spaces. Our fifth and last discussion is on justice and humanity, isolation, and interrogation, and the ultimate sentence. I am Ebony Gabriel, the Policy and Applied Work Officer of the SPSSI Graduate Student Committee, and I will be facilitating our webinar today. Any opinions or conclusions expressed in this webinars are those of the individual contributors and do not reflect the views of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, the American Psychological Association, or any other divisions or subunits. Now let's find out who our panelists are. Okay, we have Dr. Phoebe Ellsworth, who is the Frank Murphy Distinguished Professor of Psychology and Law at the University of Michigan, with an AB from Harvard and a PhD from Stanford. In addition to her work on the appraisal theory of emotion, she has conducted research in the field of psychology and law, publishing on the subjects of public opinion and the death penalty, juries, and the relationship between law and social science. She is the recipient of the APA's James McKean Cattell Award for Lifetime Achievement in Applied Research, the SESP Distinguished Scientist Award, the SPSP Legacy Award, and Career Contribution Award, as well as the APF Gold Medal Award for Life Achievement in the Science of Psychology, as well as awards from APA, APS, and SPSP for excellence in mentoring. She is the fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the board of the Death Penalty Information Center. Our next speaker is Dr. Craig Haney. His research concerns the application of social psychological principles and data to various legal and civil rights issues. He has specialized in the assessment of institutional environments, especially the psychological effects of incarceration, as well as the study of social histories of persons accused or convicted of serious violent crimes. He has also worked on the way in which attitudes and beliefs about crime and punishment are changed by legal procedures, such as death qualification, as well as the role such as attitudes and beliefs play in influencing legal fairness and impartiality. Okay, our last speaker is Dr. Jonathan Villano. He's an associate professor of psychology at the University of Pittsburgh at Greensburg. Professor Villano also teaches psychology and law courses at Pitt Oakland, including within CGS and the School of Law. His research interests include eyewitness memory, identification, to which he has testified as an expert witness in criminal cases, police investigation, interviewing, and jury decision making. Dr. Villano obtained his doctorate in psychology with the specialization in legal psychology. Most of his scholarly interests deal with issues pertaining to psychology and law, including eyewitness memory and identification, investigation, interviewing, and jury decision making. In addition to conducting research on these issues, he assists the legal system in several ways, including by serving as an expert witness um, on eyewitness memory and identification. So now I will hand it over to Dr. Villano.
Thank you very much, Ebony. I'm very, very fortunate to be on this panel. I'm not sure how well our attendees are aware of how distinguished the people that I'm with are. Phoebe and Craig are just titans in the field here. So it's such a great blessing to be here with you all today. I'm going to talk some about police interviewing with witnesses and suspects with a specific focus on a lot of my work, which has been rapport building within suspect interrogations with cooperative witnesses. So that's what I'm going to talk to you all about briefly today here. So what is rapport? How is it built? How is it measured? The most logical place to start this talk is just to address, well, what is rapport in the first place? This has been the bane of my existence probably since my graduate school days. This comes up quite a bit among practitioners and researchers in terms of, well, what do we mean by rapport? And this is an important question because rapport is such a key component for a successful interview or an interrogation, whether it be a cooperative witness who you're just trying to get the most accurate recollections of a criminal event, or it be a suspect who you think might have some criminal involvement and you want to get as much information as you can from them. Almost universally, rapport is thought to be really, really integral to a successful investigative interview. So it's really important that we at least first kind of say, or define what it is exactly. I've given you a few definitions on the second bullet point here. Rapport, by many, including myself, is described as a positive relationship involving trust and respect between the interviewer and interviewee. Not everybody agrees with that, including some law enforcement practitioners who would define it probably differently and have defined it differently as more of a working relationship. So, not necessarily positive or negative, just kind of this operational accord or this, kind of, working towards that same end goal together, something of that sort. So this bullet point just I think does a nice job of illustrating how rapport is not similarly defined by everybody from researchers to practitioners. How do you build rapport? Typically we'll see that law enforcement officials, whether it be with witnesses or suspects, will try to do that often from the outset of an interview. A lot of this is through kind of small talk, discussion about what's going on, current events, things like that. Active listening, maybe disclosing some information about themselves, saying something like, "Oh yeah, I've been a witness of a crime too, and this has happened to me," something of that sort. And then smiling, eye contact, a lot of body posture and body language as well will be used to build rapport and maintain it throughout an interview. And there's a bunch of measures that have come out fairly recently to try to measure if rapport is built or established between the two parties in an interview. You see me cite a few of them here in that last bullet point for you. What's the role of rapport within police interviews? How is it used? Why is it used? Now that we know kind of a bit more about what rapport is a tool in the toolbox for some as police investigators to try to create a comfortable environment for witnesses to help them recall as much as they can about a crime. And with suspects, it's a tool in the toolbox often to get them to provide some incriminating information about what they may have done or been involved in. So that's where rapport typically comes in. It's typically something that is focused on towards the beginning of an interview, whether it be with a witness or a suspect. If you look at certain protocols like the cognitive interview, which is used with witnesses of crimes, rapport is one of the first steps when you're interviewing witnesses, is to build that rapport to establish that comfortable environment to help them report more about the crime and more accurately so. And similarly, when we're talking about suspects who police think may be involved in some type of criminal activity, rapport is often highly recommended to be used in that setting to also try to, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for not so good reasons, sometimes in a genuine way, sometimes in a not so genuine way, all with the goal of trying to get information from somebody who may have some criminal involvement. But overall, as you see in this last bullet point, rapport is really, generally recommended pretty widely, whether it's with witnesses or suspects, that you should have law enforcement officials building rapport to try to get information from whoever they're interviewing. And that brings us maybe to the most logical follow-up question here. Well, what does rapport do in these interviews? Is it helpful? Is it useful when it's used and established? Of course, like everything In the field of psychology and law and psychology, the social sciences, well, it depends. Okay. When we're talking about cooperative witnesses, overall, rapport seems to benefit witness recall by helping them report more information and doing it more accurately. But I will even qualify that statement, even, somebody like myself who has done several studies on rapport building, not all very consistent in finding benefits, and generally speaking, the benefits are fairly small. So if you're familiar with the effect size statistic, they're generally pretty small. I found that in my studies, and the other studies I'm aware of that find that rapport helps eyewitnesses tend to be fairly small as well. And then, like I mentioned just a minute ago, even in my studies on this issue, they don't always consistently find that rapport directly enhances eyewitness recall. But I think generally speaking, the body of research as I know it now shows that, yeah, it's a benefit to eyewitness recall. It may not be a really strong benefit. To me, I think where it gets more interesting is with criminal suspects, quite honestly. There has been so much in the past 10 years, so much discussion about rapport building and how important it is in the context of criminal suspects. And it is just widely recommended, and there's good reason for that. Establishing a relationship with the suspect, the research does show helps improve the amount of information suspects report, just the comprehensiveness of their overall overall reports, as well as the diagnosticity of their confession evidence. For those of you who don't know what diagnosticity refers to in this context, the idea is that by building rapport, you tend to get more true confessions and fewer false confessions is the general idea here. So by building rapport, you're more likely to get true confessions, you're less likely to get false confessions. So you can see kind of from this bullet point why everybody would be saying rapport is hugely foundational to an interrogation and why everybody should be building rapport. But there's a huge caveat, especially in my opinion here. It depends on how rapport is used. Is my belief here. If police officers are using rapport in the context of what we call an information gathering interview approach, where they're just trying to understand the person, they're trying to, as it says, gather information and learn more about the suspect and just get details about the crime, then rapport building is definitely a beneficial tool and very, very useful. But if it's used in an accusatorial approach, which is also recommended, where you have an accusatorial approach will often look like where a law enforcement investigator believes that the suspect is definitely guilty and their primary goal is to only get a confession. Rapport building may not be such a wonderful technique in that context, because in that context, what you can see is law enforcement investigators using rapport as kind of that tool in the toolbox in a very non-genuine way, just to elicit a confession, whether true or false, without any real concern for that. So in that context, advocating for just a blanket rapport building all the time may not necessarily be such a great thing. So I think it really depends upon the context in which rapport is built. And that's a lot of what we need to try to kind of siphon out here as we move on in our own research agendas. So where does this leave us? Rapport is going to continue to be a huge topic, I think. It's really picked up steam in the past 10 to 15 years. I started out looking at witnesses and rapport, but I've kind of shifted over some to suspects just because of how much attention rapport has got within the suspect domain, and I don't see that stopping anytime soon. In fact, I see this probably just even picking up in some sense because of how important law enforcement investigators and detectives and researchers think rapport is to a successful interview or interrogation. And to be clear, rapport is a good thing to advocate. It's a humane thing to do, especially if it's genuinely established and built with the interviewer and interviewee. And it certainly can lead to a lot of good benefits with witnesses and suspects. So it's definitely a good thing to be doing. But there are some kind of things that we've got to figure out a lot more, especially as we think about policy recommendations and implications. And I think as many people are now starting to point out, unsurprisingly, is just the issue of, well, what is rapport exactly? Like, how do you build it? How do we know that building it in this way versus that way is going to have the intended effects? I can attest to this doing research on this topic for longer than I ever expected, is that it is really difficult to come up with a concrete conceptual and operational definition for what rapport is. And as an experimental psychologist, to have a really good internally valid manipulation of rapport building in research. It's super difficult. That's why a lot of the research is very field oriented and kind of looking at, you know, actual field research of building rapport versus not building rapport and what the outcomes are rather than some good experimental research. So we've got to do a better job, I think, figuring out what rapport exactly is and how to best measure it. And I think we've come a long way in the past 10 years, but we still got a long way to go to kind of solidify that. And then again, as I said just a minute ago, we really need to, I think, do a better job figuring out some of the moderators for rapport building and its benefits, or in some cases detriments with especially suspects, because depending upon the context it's used, or maybe depending upon whether it's genuinely used or perceived that way, that could certainly affect the outcomes that it has. Thank you very much. I will turn it over to my remaining panelists.
Okay, I'm talking about the death penalty in America, and this first uh, slide shows you the death penalty all over the world. Um, the black countries are countries that have no death penalty. The light blue countries, including us, are the countries that have a death penalty, and the kind of in between ones uh, basically have a death penalty but don't use it much. Some of them have a death penalty, but only for crimes such as treason and extremely rare crimes, and other ones have it on the books, but basically haven't executed anybody for 10 or 20 years, or they've signed on to some international conference opposed to the death penalty. So about 70% of the countries don't use the death penalty in practice. But as you can see, there are some really big ones like us, India, and China that do have a death penalty. Okay, now let's look at America. Um, Here you see the states that have the death penalty and don't have the death penalty. 27 states have a death penalty and 23 states don't have a death penalty. The striped states are states that have a death penalty but have a moratorium on using it, so that um, they're worried about things like mistakes and discrimination. So while the death penalty is still on the books, nobody's getting executed in those states. Um, Now, only about 10 states actually use the death penalty. Um, Florida and Texas are leading the way. So there's a lot of these death penalty states that have it on the books, but haven't executed anybody for a long time. Ebony asked me to address why some states have it and some states don't. And That's, as you can see, if you look at red states and blue states, that's one uh, factor that's a strong predictor. In the beginning, all the states had the death penalty. Then one by one, they began to abolish it. And state where I am, Michigan, was the first to abolish the death penalty. And they did it because they had a high publicity execution where they executed an innocent person, and they thought, okay, never again, this isn't worth it. And other states have abolished it over the years, but their reasons differ. I mean, sometimes it's a crime like that, and then sometimes the state will bring it back if there's been a particularly heinous murder. Okay, so Ebony also asked me, what are the criteria for deciding whether somebody gets death or life? That's a really impossible question, because they're all over the place. In fact, in 1972, the Supreme Court abolished the death penalty in the United States. And the reason was that there were no criteria, that you just send the jury in a murder trial into the jury room and they decide, is this person guilty or not guilty? And if he's guilty, do we vote for death or life? And in Furman, the Supreme Court basically found uh, that these decisions were completely arbitrary, that there's no way to distinguish who was getting the death penalty from who wasn't. And worse, there was fairly strong evidence that it was not just arbitrary, but discriminatory against Blacks and other minority groups. But the states actually, many states really wanted to have a death penalty, so they tried to bring back death penalty laws that would make it less arbitrary. And in 1976, the Supreme Court decided that the death penalty was constitutional if you clearly specified what were the legitimate factors you were allowed to consider in sentencing somebody to death. So each state would have a list of aggravating factors, things like was it a murder of more than one person? Was it a murder committed during the course of another felony, like a murder during a robbery or during a rape? And if you found one of those things, then you could vote for the death penalty. But if you didn't, then you couldn't. And that was supposed to create clear standards so that you could differentiate between death penalty and not death penalty. But the states, I mean, in studying anything in criminal justice, you run up to the fact that we have no national policy. Each state gets to decide for themselves. So every state that has the death penalty has a somewhat different set of aggravating factors that the jury's allowed to consider. And so some of them have killing a police officer, then you can go for the death penalty. But some of these aggravating factors are very vague. So one, for example, that several states have is this a murder particularly heinous, atrocious, and cruel? Well, that's clearly, there are no clear standards for that, and it allows a lot of room for the jury's emotions to come in and play a role. And the research continues to show that other illegitimate factors continue to influence who gets sentenced to death and who doesn't. So race is still a factor. Race of the victim is a big factor. If you kill a white person, you're more likely to get the death penalty than if you kill a black person. Money, obviously, rich people don't get executed. And then, of course, geography, as you saw from the map before, that in Michigan, you never get the death penalty. And even in states that have it, often there are, 3 or 4 counties that account for almost all the executions. Okay, so a few things about uh, experience of death row. How long do people spend on death row? And as you can see, this has been going up over the years. And by now, the average amount of time is a little over 22 years. During this time, uh, the prisoners are mostly in solitary. And of course, they have no access to any kind of educational or mental health programs because they're not supposed to live that long. But they do, on average, spend 22 years. It's gotten longer over the years because there have been many more appeals. So what's the outcome? What happens to you if you get a death sentence? Okay, the most likely thing that happens is that your sentence is reversed, that 38% of death sentences are eventually reversed on appeal. This is since 1973. 200 people had their sentences reversed because they were found to be the wrong guy. They were not the person that committed the crime in the first place. A lot of others were reversed because prosecutorial misconduct, various mistakes, racism in selecting the jury, a number of illegal factors, but not clear evidence that the person was innocent. And in those cases, the person's death sentence is reversed and they end up spending life in prison without the possibility of parole. Okay, the percent who were executed is about 16%, so fairly low. And the rest of them are mostly still on death row and will be there until either their sentence gets reversed, which still happens, or they die in prison. And you can see they're way down at the bottom. There's a few people who just had life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and died. And then even fewer than that is a governor or somebody commuting the sentence, deciding to that this person's case is so sympathetic that they will not get the death penalty. Okay, where am I on time, Ebony? I can't. I think it's well. Show you a couple more. Okay, here are the number of death sentences since 1972. And you can see that during the 80s and 90s, they were extremely high, but since then, they have been going down year by year. And this reflects, I think, public opinion in America that the Americans are much less in favor of the death penalty than they used to be. And some people feel that eventually it may not be abolished by the Supreme Court, but it's just going to sort of wither away because it's become relatively unpopular. People became aware in the 90s through DNA evidence that, in fact, it was possible to execute a person who was completely innocent. And it's now been the case for a long time that if you're in a death penalty jury, your only choices are the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. So there's no chance that this person's going to get out and start murdering people again. Um, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Great. All right, my turn. Thank you. Ebony, thank you for putting this panel together, and thank you to my colleagues for these really informative presentations. Ebony has selected the two people who are at the absolute top of their fields in the respective topics on which they presented. Let me turn your attention to a slightly different issue. I'm going to talk a bit about the use of solitary confinement in the United States. I've got my email address here, and I'm going to talk about a lot of things. I'm going to talk about them quickly. Write down my email address, and if you want further information on this, I'm happy to send you things, including this most recent literature review on some of the research that's been done, not just on solitary confinement, but on the adverse effects of social isolation. The social psychologists in the audience know that as a colleague of ours, Phoebe and mine, Elliot Aronson, once titled a book, we are social animals. We are, all of us, very dependent on social contact, social interaction, to ground our day-to-day identities, to bring meaning to our life. This is an area of research that's not just confined to social psychologists nowadays, but it is in fact a broadly studied topic in psychology, a recognized issue. The importance of human connection, I think, has been featured really in lots and lots of studies in both neurobiology as well as social psychology. You may well know that we are told now that there is an epidemic of loneliness and isolation in the world, not just in nursing homes, but throughout the world. The experience of loneliness and isolation affects us not just psychologically, but also affects us physically in terms of our life expectancy. We are so dependent on each other for meaning in our existence. And as I said earlier, for an understanding of who we are in the world. The question becomes, what happens when we're denied the opportunity to have contact? Well, we've all just experienced this. The pandemic exposed all of us, involuntarily exposed us to a form of social isolation. And there has been an extraordinary number of studies done just since the pandemic ended about the adverse impact of having experienced that social isolation. Social isolation, which was painful for us, not just painful, but social isolation, which we're now learning has changed and affected a lot of people. Now imagine the unpleasant, painful experience of the pandemic that we all just went through times 1,000. Solitary confinement in the United States is perhaps the most complete form of involuntary isolation imposed on anyone in our society. Solitary confinement is typically defined as being confined to a cell for upwards of 23 hours a day. In some facilities, it's closer to 24. There are, as I'm speaking to you now, between 80 to 100,000 persons in solitary confinement in the United States, in jails and prisons across the country. People can be placed there for a variety of disciplinary infractions, for gang membership and for their own physical protection. They are disproportionately, people housed in solitary confinement are disproportionately persons of color, and even more disproportionately, the mentally ill. It will come as no surprise to you that mentally ill persons who are incarcerated oftentimes have a difficult time conforming their conduct to the requirements of the prison, and so are more likely to receive disciplinary infractions and therefore are disproportionately represented in solitary confinement. The range of terms that someone spends in solitary confinement can last for a few days, and even in some instances, a few decades, literally a few decades, with average terms being between 6 months to a year. In the research that I've done around the country, and by now I've done structured interviews with well over 1,000 people housed in solitary confinement in prison systems around the country, I can tell you that whatever else they are experiencing, these units have created widespread suffering. Virtually everybody who is in these units is in pain. And that pain, the primary source of which is the social isolation, is also in solitary confinement exacerbated by additional dimensions that worsen the effects of social deprivation. There is a geography of pain, which is added to the social isolation. Many solitary confinement units, and certainly supermax prisons, are located in remote geographical locations, so that people who are confined in them are distanced not just from each other inside the institution, but from the surrounding environment. This is the maximum security federal facility in Florence, Colorado. This is Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit or Solitary Confinement Unit Supermax in California. It is surrounded by perhaps one of the most beautiful state parks in the United States, a redwood national forest. The prisoners who are in solitary confinement never get to see this. It is at the remotest corner of the state of California. So there is a geography to the pain which is imposed upon the social isolation. There is an architecture to the pain which exacerbates the experience. Most of these units, and certainly supermax prisons, are built in ways that suggest that they're anything but a place where human beings will live. Most of them look like storage facilities for inanimate objects, both in terms of the exterior, which oftentimes lacks windows, and the interior as well. But there is more to the architecture that induces the pain. The environment in which people live, where they live literally around the clock, requires them to be confined in cells that are typically no more than 80 square feet in dimension. This is the size of a small bathroom or a small parking space. People live literally, as I said, for months and years inside a space that looks something like this. For that hour or two a day when they're allowed out of their cell to yard, the yards oftentimes resemble nothing so much as another cage. This is the so-called yard at the Pelican Bay Security Housing Unit, Supermax Prison in California, a concrete enclosed yard where prisoners are allowed out for an hour a day. In other instances, they're placed in outdoor cages. So again, when you hear they have an hour a day for outdoor exercise or yard, we're talking about experiences that take place in environments that look like this. The architecture of pain also includes, in many of these housing units, gun walks, so that even when prisoners are in their cells, they are subject around the clock to gun coverage, as it's euphemistically called. In addition to the geography and architecture of pain, there is a social psychology of pain that determines how these units are run. Supermax prisons have been designed to minimize contact between prisoners and staff. So to the extent to which technology allows it, prisoners are controlled through computerized locking mechanisms and televised camera surveillance rather than personal interaction between staff and prisoners. When they are allowed out of their cells to go out for exercise in some of these units, that outdoor exercise is electronically controlled so that a staff member doesn't really interact with a prisoner, simply pushes a button, the door opens, they go out to the yard. When the time is up, the door opens again automatically through an electronic device. All the time they are being monitored over a television, surveillance screens in the outdoor exercise area, minimizing the contact between staff and prisoners. And as I said, a prisoner's entire life in solitary confinement is lived within the cell, which means they eat, sleep, and defecate within the same space. If you're confined in your cell 23 hours a day, it means you eat in your cell. There are tray slots on every door, and 3 times a day, food is delivered. The tray slots also substitute for cuff slots. When prisoners are escorted out of their cells, they are always placed in restraints before the cell door is open, and that restraining process takes place through the tray or cuff slot of the door of the cell. Typically, typically contact visiting is prohibited in these units. So to the extent to which you have any contact with outside relatives or friends who might want to visit you, it is done on a non-contact basis. You talk through a window and over a phone rather than having any physical contact. And in fact, what that means is for the entire period of time during which you are housed in solitary confinement, you are denied an opportunity for caring human touch. The only time you touch another human being is in the incidental contact you have between yourself and a correctional officer who's putting you in mechanical restraints. Mechanical restraints are pervasive in these units. Every time prisoners are moved under escort, they are placed in elaborate forms of waist chains, ankle chains, handcuffs, and so on, as they are escorted through the institution to perhaps a parole hearing or a doctor's appointment, etc. They are treated inside these units in the most degrading and dehumanizing possible ways, oftentimes treated in ways that are reserved only for the control of animals, not human beings. Even in instances in which prisoners are lucky enough to get an opportunity to see a therapist, the therapeutic contact typically takes place in an environment that looks like something like this, with the prisoner in a cage, conversing with his therapist in the therapist's office under these circumstances. There is an anatomy to the pain which is created inside these units, as you might imagine. This is the kind of research I've been doing over the last 20 or 30 years. What are the effects? Well, as you might imagine, the effects are many and varied. So there are many, many, many studies now which have been done which show that there are a range of adverse symptoms inside these units: depression, anxiety, cognitive disorders, high rates of self-harm and suicidality, by far the very highest in any prison system. And again, not just my research, but research done by numerous other people have shown that there is an increment of suffering that is imposed on persons in solitary confinement that is in addition to the already serious and severe pains of imprisonment. In addition, when people are in social isolation, solitary confinement for long periods of time, they adapt to the environment, and oftentimes they adapt to the environment in socially dysfunctional ways. There are social pathologies that people develop in order to survive in this environment. They get used to living in an environment without people, which means that when they are placed back in environments where there are people, oftentimes they experience overwhelming social anxiety, social phobias, and self-isolate and live subsequent lives of asociality. Because so much of who we are is grounded in our day-to-day interactions with other people, prisoners in solitary confinement tell me oftentimes that they begin to question whether they still exist. There is an experience of derealization, what I've called here is ontological insecurity. Am I really here? If I don't have an impact on the world, if I have no social interactions with people where I get a response from another human being, am I really alive? Do I really exist? Perhaps not surprisingly, long-term isolated prisoners develop something, in my opinion, beyond even depression. It is a kind of deep melancholia, a joylessness, a kind of grief, a grief about their current existence, a grief about what they've lost. And in extreme cases, they experience what I've called here social death. they have basically given up the expectation that they will ever live again among other people. It is in some ways the final stages of the adaptation to long-term solitary confinement. One bright spot in this otherwise very depressing story comes from our organization, the American Psychological Association, a task force that I worked with just last year. Made a recommendation to the American Psychological Association, which was overwhelmingly passed by the association, prohibiting the punitive isolation of juveniles, at least in juvenile justice settings, setting out guidelines for when and how social isolation should ever be used in an extremely limited basis, and also identifying groups of people for whom it should never be used. So this is now the official position of the American Psychological Association. But needless to say, there is still much more to be done on this issue. It is, as I said at the outset, a punitive practice that in the neighborhood of 100,000 people still are being subjected to in the United States, with all of the adverse effects that I described earlier being inflicted upon them. And on that note, I'll end. Thank you. Try to stop sharing.
Okay, thank you so much to our panelists. Let's see here, what questions we have in the chat. Okay, so we have a question here. Does the death penalty reduce crime? So all of you are entitled to answer that, whoever wants to go first.
Okay, there have been quite a lot of studies. I mean, that's one of the major rationales for having a death penalty, is that it deters other people from committing murder. But so far, all of the studies show that it doesn't make a difference. So if you have 3 states, neighboring states, 2 with a death penalty and 1 without, the murder rates are no different across those states. If a state abolishes the death penalty, crime rates don't go up. If the state reinstates a death penalty, crime rates don't go down. So, I mean, there are still some people who argue that it must, but mostly when you're committing a murder, you're not thinking rationally about the long-term consequences for yourself. So, and many, many people don't even know whether they live in a death penalty state or not. So anybody else feel free to chip in. Have any more questions?
No.
Okay, so let's see here what we have. Okay, so one question that we have is, are most inhumane interrogations happening due to discrimination amongst groups or global enemies, such as those involved in war?
Oh, that's a great question. Certainly there's a large cadre of people that deal with, kind of international interrogations and how cultural ethnic differences could play a role. I can probably speak less to that and just speak kind of more to the overall kind of way that these interrogations work. And I think generally, for if somebody's a suspect, that there are law enforcement officials who will just pretty much assume that they're guilty. And then in the US, we, allow for some pretty psychologically coercive techniques to be used on them. And these may or may not necessarily be guilty people. Of course, one of the most jarring examples of that is that in the US you can provide or you can suggest you have evidence against somebody that you don't actually have, so you could say, oh, we have your fingerprints at the crime scene. Why don't you tell us what you did? Something of that nature, and that can be persuasive to not only the guilty but also the innocent, unfortunately. And I think largely the goal of researchers in this area, and hopefully a lot of practitioners, is to help get it right and avoid getting it wrong. So trying to figure out interrogation techniques that are not going to disproportionately affect one group or the other, and that are just going to get true and accurate information, including confessions, and are going to lower the chances of getting false information.
Okay, so our next question is, so prisons that incorporate the 23-1 policy, um, why is that allowed? And is that allowed, I guess, in all prisons, I should say.
Yeah. So it's allowed because the United States Supreme Court hasn't yet and may never declare it unconstitutional. It has been declared unconstitutional in certain jurisdictions. Phoebe said earlier that the death penalty is not uniformly applied in the United States. We have individual state systems that not only apply individual criminal laws like the death penalty, but we also have individual state prison systems that are governed by different sets of rules and regulations. Until the United States Supreme Court declares something unconstitutional across the board, those states are allowed to operate with their own procedures and practices. Now, I've been involved in lawsuits in a number of parts of the country where certain aspects of solitary confinement, especially as it's used for certain groups of people, has been declared unconstitutional. For example, I showed you some photographs of Pelican Bay, which I've referred to in my presentation a couple of times. It's the Supermax prison in California. In a lawsuit that we filed in the early 1990s and that was decided in the mid 1990s, a federal judge removed all of the mentally ill prisoners from that facility, declaring that solitary confinement, at least in California for the mentally ill, was unconstitutional. But other states where those lawsuits have not yet been brought, the practice proceeds, even, as I said, for the mentally ill, and including, despite the American Psychological Association's recommendation to the contrary, in juvenile facilities. So there are juvenile facilities around the country that have been permitted to subject persons under the age of 18 to solitary confinement. It's typically for a shorter period of time, but nonetheless, it proceeds.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. I think you answered this question, Dr. Haney. What are the statistics on inmates who are sent to solitary confinement, and how many suffer from mental illness?
Well, in terms of numbers who suffer from mental illness, I mean, in my experience, I would estimate in most of these units, nearly half of the people who are there have diagnosed mental health conditions, conditions that have been diagnosed by the prison system, who nonetheless places them in solitary confinement. There are numbers of studies that have been done on the longer term effects. So what happens to people when they come out of solitary confinement? And indeed, when they come out of solitary confinement and are released. So one of the things we find, perhaps not surprisingly, much higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder among released prisoners who were once in solitary confinement, and also a lessened life expectancy. So there's some really interesting research done by a researcher in the University of North Carolina, Brinkley Rubenstein, who's found that people who have released prisoners who have ever served terms in solitary confinement actually live shorter periods of time once they're released from prison than those who have never been in solitary confinement. So the effects are not just psychological, but they appear to be physical or medical in nature as well.
Okay, thank you for that. So it looks like we have a few more questions here that came in. Okay, so it says, Craig, you've written about solitary confinement as a form of social death. Do you see parallels in the way undocumented immigrants are held and dehumanized in the current carceral immigration system?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question, isn't it? Nowadays, especially. So yes, I didn't mention it, but it is the case that solitary confinement is used on a widespread basis in immigration detention facilities. It is a form of aggressive, punitive social control, and in environments like prisons or immigration detention facilities, it's one of the things that prison authorities do to control large populations of people whom they're willing to dehumanize. And that applies to people who are now in immigration detention as well as people who we've confined in our prisons. So yes, there are parallels. And obviously in immigration detention, the experience of being in immigration detention and perhaps even in solitary confinement is oftentimes then followed by deportation, where they're subjected to another form of social death, being returned to a place, to a society that perhaps they haven't lived in for years or decades.
Okay, so our next two questions. Let's see, we have a question here from Heather. As an alternative to the death penalty, life without parole is often used. What has research shown about the mental effects on an individual of knowing they will never be released? Are there similar findings of the effects as being placed in solitary confinement?
Yes, well, if you're on death row, you're basically in solitary confinement. But if you're in life without the possibility of parole, you're very often in solitary confinement too. Um, the and everything that Craig has said about the um, mental consequences of that would apply here. The question, though, is whether if you know you'll never get out, that has mental health consequences. There's not a whole lot of research on that compared to research on people on death row. Uh, but I will say that once the death penalty is abolished, then researchers' attention is going to turn full speed to life without the possibility of parole. And the final thing I'll say is that hope springs eternal in human beings, and many people don't really deep down believe that it'll be without the possibility of parole, just as many people think there's a chance that they won't be executed. And they're right. I mean, 38% of the people get their cases reversed. So, um, so there are certainly mental health consequences. There are mental health differences coming in, and they're exacerbated by the punishment.
Okay, and our last question we have here, the impact from Professor John Brown Child's research on communality to prisoners and would not treating prisoners more humanely truly help prisoners to be less difficult to oversee and help with attitude overall?
Yes, the answer is yes. John Brown's child is a colleague and a friend of mine, and yes, the transcommunality program that he's instituted in Soledad and several other prisons in California has been enormously successful. It is, I think, not only a more humane or a more effective kind of program to implement inside prison systems. It requires, a certain level of imagination on the part of prison authorities. I think the return to solitary confinement in the United States, which began in the early 1980s, reflects a lack of imagination. We went back to doing something that we had done in the 19th century, even though it had been long discredited. I think partly because there was massive overcrowding and prison authorities didn't really know how to respond to it. And so they responded to it in the only way they knew how, which was by locking more people up for longer periods of time under more desperate kinds of punitive conditions. There are programs like John Brown Childs', however, that try to approach issues inside prison in a much more humane and, as I said, much more effective way. So the short answer to your question is yes, it would be much better if only we would do more of it.
Okay, so that is all of our questions, and it looks like we are at time. I want to thank all of our panelists today for coming out and talking to us today, and thank you so much for all of our attendees. Thank you for your participation, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
It's no problem. Take
Bye-bye.
care.